In this presentation, we're going to go through Maggid, and the main thing we're going to focus on is the flow and structure of Maggid. So let's begin. We're going to start by seeing the main parts of Maggid. So we have at the beginning Heilach Ma'anya, followed by the Manashtana, followed by Avodah Meinu, then Mitchila Ivda Avodah Zara, then by Arami Evid Avi, and then finally we have Pesach Matzah Omer, and the section that has Bechol Davadar, Lefichach, which includes Halal, and the Bracha of Asher Golano. Okay, so we're going to begin by pointing out a general way of looking at Maggid. So we're going to begin by seeing the core of Maggid. The core of Maggid is that it's said in a question and answer format. Like the Torah says, Ki Sholcha Bincha, and then V'Gadata. And essentially that's captured in the Manashtana, followed by Avodah Meinu, Mitchila, and Arami Evid Avi. So the question part is, like we said, the Manashtana. How about the answer? So the Mishnah says is Maschel Begnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach. And one opinion says Maschel Begnus is Avodah Meinu, and the other one says the Maschel Begnus is Mitchila Ivda Avodah Zara Haya V'Seinu. And the Rif writes Va'idna, and now Avdinon Ketarvayu. We follow both opinions. So we have Avodah Meinu and Mitchila Ivda Avodah Zara Haya V'Seinu. And then the Mishnah continues and says, after Maschel Begnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach, V'Deirish, we expound, as we're going to see, on the psukim of Arami Evid Avi, which are psukim that are said in Parshas Kisavei when a person brings Bikurim, and it speaks all about Galus Mitzrayim and Yitzias Mitzrayim. So this is really the core of the Haggadah, the core of Maggid. We have the Ki Yisholcha in the Manashtana, and we have the V'Gadata in the Avodah Meinu, the Mitchila, and the Arami Evid Avi. Now beforehand, we have the Heilach Ma'anya, which essentially what Heilach Ma'anya is that before anything, we invite the needy. It's also brought down that the Heilach Ma'anya is that the first thing we do is that we introduce the matzah, because the matzah is the centerpiece of the Seder. So we say Heilach Ma'anya before we begin anything. We first say Heilach Ma'anya, this is the matzah, and we speak about it. Now for the last two parts, so we have Pesach Matzah Omer. So after the Mishnah that we quoted before, the next Mishnah begins with a teaching from Rabbi Gamliel, and that is that one must say Pesach Matzah Omer in order to be Yetzeh, the mitzvah of saying the Haggadah. So that's the next thing that we do. We have the section of Pesach Matzah Umar, and then finally that Mishnah continues and says Bechol Davadar and Lefichach and the Bracha of Asher Golanu. And so that's how we conclude the Haggadah by saying Bechol Davadar. We have to see as if we ourselves left Mitzrayim. Lefichach, we need to praise Hashem, and then we make the Bracha of Asher Golanu, as we'll go through all of this in the upcoming sections. Okay, so let's begin with the Heilach Ma'anya. So for starters, we have over here the text. We're going to have the entire text of the Haggadah. Every part of the Haggadah will appear in this presentation. So we start, like we said, by inviting anyone that needs a place. And before saying Hey Lach Ma'anya, we're saying, hey, this is the Lach Ma'anya, so we uncover the matzahs before we speak about them. Then we move on to the Manashtana, which is essentially the beginning of Maggid, in that it has to be structured as a question, Ki Sholcha, and V'Gadata. So we start with the Manashtana. We have over here the 4 questions. So a few things to point out over here is that number 1, like we already said, the Haggadah is said in a question-answer format. Number 2, before the Manashtana, we cover the matzahs, because the matzahs only have to be uncovered when we give the answer. It's called Lechem Oini because it's bread that we answer on it. Lechem She'oinim Olav Dvarim Harbe. So for the question, it's covered. As we'll see, once we get to the answer, it remains uncovered the entire Maggid, except at certain points, which is basically whenever we pick up the kais, the wine, then we cover the matzahs in order not to embarrass them. Another thing is that we move the kaira before Manashtana so that the kids ask about it. And so naturally after Manashtana, we'll move it back. And the fourth and final point is that before the Manashtana, we pour the second cup of wine, because the second cup of wine is by Maggid, and Maggid starts with the Manashtana. Moving along, we then say Avodah Meinu L'Pari B'Mitzrayim. And so like we already pointed out, the Mishnah says that there are 2 parts to the answer to the Manashtana. Number 1 is Maschel Begnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach. And number 2, the person is Deirish Marami Evid Avi Ad Sheyigmer Kol HaParsha Kula. Now, like we said, there are 2 opinions about Maschel Begnus U'Mesayim B'Shevach. One is that it means we start with Avodah Meinu and we end with Vayitzienu. And the other one is that Gnus is Mitchila Oivda Avodah Zara Haya V'Seinu. And then afterwards Hashem brought us to serve Him. And like we said, today we follow both opinions. And so we begin with Avodah Meinu. Now, before we get into this, we'll just point out that number 1, at this point, we move back to Kaira, because we only moved it away in order for the kids to ask. So right after the Manashtana, we move back to Kaira. And number 2, we uncover the matzahs until the end of Maggid, except for the times when we pick up the kais, where then we cover the matzahs so as not to embarrass them. Now, this section of Avodah Meinu essentially says that we were slaves to Pari and Mitzrayim, and Hashem took us out of there. And if He would have not taken us out of Mitzrayim, then we would still be slaves to Pari and Mitzrayim until today. Now, before we continue to the next section, which is Mitchila, there are a few things. So between Avodah Meinu and Mitchila, we say 5 things. Number 1, the importance of the Saper B'Yitzias Mitzrayim, even for great Chachamim. Number 2, we bring a story to support this, the Ma'aseh Rebbe Lezer that occurred in Bnei Brak. Number 3, we say that we mention Yetzias Mitzrayim even at night and even by Yom Mashiach. And the reason it comes in over here is because this teaching was taught, it was introduced at the story that happened in Bnei Brak with Rabbi Lezer. Number 4, we say that we speak of it to every type of son, the 4 sons. So we're saying essentially over here that it's even for great Chachamim, and we're bringing a story to support it. And we're saying that it's even at night, and even by Yom Mashiach. And we're saying that it has to be taught to every type of son. Now it's also brought down that the way this comes up, the 4 types of sons, is because once we said that it's a mitzvah l'saper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the extent of its importance, so now we're going to start doing it. We're going to start teaching about Yetzias Mitzrayim. And how do we teach about it? By bringing the 4 psukim that speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim and explaining them. And then finally, number 5, we explain the teaching of Yochel Merish Chodesh, which teaches about the connection of the Saper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim to this night of Pesach specifically. And it's brought down that some explain that the reason this comes in over here is because it's actually part of the answer to the She'enei Yedei Lishol, or others explain it's because in the answer to the She'enei Yedei Lishol, we say this pasuk of Bavor Zeh, so therefore now we go on to explain it. So just to review quickly, so essentially we said that Avada Me'inu, and Hashem took us out, and if He didn't take us out, we'd still be slaves, and in continuation to that, we said about the importance L'Saper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim, even for great Chachamim, and brought a story to support it. And then we said that the mitzvah of speaking by Yetzias Mitzrayim is even at night, and even by Yom Mashiach. Then we said that it has to be done to every type of son, and then we spoke about its special connection to this night specifically. So now let's move on just to see the texts. So first we have Afilu Kolanu Chachamim, Kolanu Ravainim, still mitzvah leinu l'saper, and v'chol amarbe is meshubach. Then we brought a story of Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yeshua, the 5 Tanaim that were in Bnei Brak and they're Mesaper until the morning. Then we continue to the teaching of Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah that a person has to speak of Yetzias Mitzrayim even in the nights and even when Mashiach comes, and this happened in the story of Bnei Brak. Then we move on to Baruch Hamok and Baruch Hu, which is an introduction to the 4 sons, the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and the Einei Yedei Lishol. And then we conclude with the teaching of Yochel Merish Chodesh, using the pasuk of Bavor Zeh that was said to the She'enei Yedei Lishol. And with that, we conclude the section of Avada Me'inu, and we move on to the next section, which is Mitchila Ovda Avodah Zarah Hayavasenu. Now, this one is much shorter. So we have the Mitchila Ovda Avodah Zarah Hayavasenu and Ve'achshav Kavona Hamokim Lavedosai. And then we bring psukim to support this. It says Shnei Amar, and we bring psukim where we see that used to be Ovda Avodah Zarah, and then Hashem brought the Yidden to serve Him. Now, in continuation to Mitchila, we also say a few more paragraphs. So after Mitchila, we talk about Hashem keeping His promise and how Hashem's promise stood for the Yidden throughout all generations. So this comes in continuation to speaking about how Hashem took the Yidden out of Mitzrayim in Avada Me'inu and how Hashem brought the Yidden to serve Him in Mitchila. So now we talk about Hashem's promise to the Yidden. So now we say Baruch Shemer Avtechaso Yisrael, and we speak specifically about Hashem's promise to Avram Avinu that He will eventually take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim. And then in continuation to that, we say V'hi Shamdo, this promise that Hashem gave to the Yidden, it stood for our fathers and for us, because throughout all the generations, many have tried to destroy the Yidden, and Hashem always saved us. Now by V'hisha Amda, based on Kabbalah, we hold a case while saying V'hisha Amda. So this is based on an Inyan of Kabbalah, and so like we said, in order not to embarrass the matzahs, we will now cover them before picking up the case. And so obviously, once we put down the case, we'll again uncover the matzahs. And so with that, we finish Mitchila, and we move on to the next section, which is Tzei Ulmad. And we say over here, Tzei Ulmad Mabikesh Lavan Arami Lasas Liyaakov Avinu, that Parai only decreed to kill the males, but Lavan, he wanted to uproot everything, he wanted to kill everyone. And then we bring the psukim from Parshas Kisaveh that start with Arami Eved Avi, that Lavan desired to kill Yaakov, and then later Vayered Mitzrayim, that Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim. And this is the start of the 4 psukim that speak about the descent and the Golus of Mitzrayim and the Geula from Mitzrayim. And now the Agadah will expound on these 4 psukim, and we're going to see over here very clearly how from this point until the end, it's all explaining these 4 psukim. Now, like we said already, we put the case down and again uncover the matzahs. That's before Tzei Ulmad, and like we just said, the Agadah is now derish 4 psukim that speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim. So let's first see these 4 psukim. So they're going to come up in a different color to indicate that it's not actually in the text, but we're going to see how it goes through each of these 4 psukim. So the Agadah begins with focusing on Arami Eved Avi, the first pasuk. And the Agadah says, Arami Eved Avi, Vayerd Mitzrayim, Vayargu Sham B'msei Ma'ot, Vayisham L'gei Gadol Otzum V'rav. And then he quotes from these psukim, each of the words from Vayerd Mitzrayim, and he either explains what they mean, or he gives a proof to them, or he shows some type of connection to what it says in these psukim. Vayerd Mitzrayim, Anos Al Pia Dibur. Vayargu Sham, Melamed Shelo Yared Yaakov Avinu Lishtakei B'Mitzrayim. And we're not going to read the entire thing, but it goes through each of these words. B'msei Ma'at, Kamei Shenemar B'shivim Nefesh. Vayisham L'goi, Melamed Shelo Yisrael Mitziyanim. Gadol V'Otzum, again Shenemar. V'Rav, Kama Shenemar. And then he goes on to the next pasuk. So we're just going back over here to see how it comes from those psukim. Then he moves on to quote Vayireyo Sanu Mitzrim, and he quotes the words afterwards. After bringing the whole pasuk, it's going to say Vayireyo Sanu Mitzrim, K'moshenemar, Vayanunu, K'moshenemar, V'yitnu Leinu Avodah Kasha, K'moshenemar. Then we move on to the next pasuk, Vanitzak, and again, every one of the words is going to be explained. After saying Vanitzak al Hashem Lekei Avasenu, Vayishma Hashem Eskalenu, Vayaris Anyenu, V'esam Aleinu, V'eslachatzenu, we continue and say Vanitzak al Hashem Lekei Avasenu, K'moshenemar. Vayishma Hashem Eskalenu, K'moshenemar, Vayaris Anyenu, Zu Precious Derech Eretz, V'esam Aleinu, Elu Abonim, V'eslachatzenu, Ze Adchak. And then we move on to the final pasuk. Vayitzein Hashem Mitzrayim, B'yad chazak over Zerei Netuya, over Meir Gadol, over Isis and Meifsim, and then we say Vayitzein Hashem Mitzrayim, Lo Yaldei Malach. So it's an explanation of those words. B'yad chazaka Ze Hadever, over Zerei Netuya, Zu Acherev, over Meir Gadol, Ze Gilei Shchina, over Isis Ze Hamate, and then finally over Meifsim. And so you can see over here by over Meifsim we're saying Ze Hadom, K'moshenemar v'nesati Meifsim. So we have the word Meifsim b'Shemaim v'Aretz. The next words, they're part of this pasuk. Dam ve'esh v'simris ashan are part of the pasuk. That's something separate. And it's just that these words are written separately and set aside in a prominent way because we pour out wine into a broken kli while saying Dam ve'esh v'simris ashan. And like it's found in the Agada, there's a special kavanah to have over here, which it says everybody should have this kavanah. Now the Baal Agada continues and presents a different explanation on the majority of this pasuk. And he says, B'yad chazaka, that's two words. So we have shtayim. Uva Zerei Netuya, again, two words, shtayim. Uva Meir Gadol, again, two words, shtayim. Uva Isis, it's plural, so shtayim. Uva Meifsim, also plural, shtayim. Now if you count, you have over here 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So says the Baal Agada, Eilu Eser Makais. And we say the 10 makas, again, like we said, by Dam Ve'esh V'Simris Ashan, we pour out wine into a broken kli while saying the makas and their simon. And again, there's a special kavanah over here. And then we present, Rabbi Yehuda would give simanim, the tzach, adash, ba'achav. And then again over there, this is the simon for the 10 makas, and we pour out wine by the tzach, by adash, and ba'achav. And it's explained that the reason Rabbi Yehuda gives the simon is because when we look at Tehillim, the makas are presented in a different order. And even in Chumash, even though this is the order, we could say Ein Muktam Umocher Batera. So he gives the simon to say that this is the actual order. So now that we poured out a lot of wine, there still remains some wine in the cup. So we leave the remaining wine in the cup. It's considered good wine, and we just add more wine to it. So this really covers a large part of the Agada. Now moving along, after this expounding and explaining of those 4 psukim, so we proceed to discuss further this last part, which is the 10 makas. And we proceed to present 3 opinions. One is that the makas were also by the yam. One is that each makkah was 4 makas. And one is that each makkah was 5 makas. So we begin with Rabbi Yossi Aglidi, who says that there were also makas by the yam, and there was actually 50 makas by the yam. Then we move on to Rabbi Lezer, who speaks about how each makkah was really a makkah of 4 makas. And then Rabbi Akiva says that each makkah was a makkah of 5 makas. Now, after enumerating all that Hashem did, we proceed to emphasize it further with Dayenu. Now, there's actually an opinion that says that from Rabbi Akiva until the end of L'chaper al Kol V'Nisenu, it's all the teaching of Rabbi Akiva, and so that's how it comes up. So either it comes up in continuation as part of this teaching of Rabbi Akiva, or it's once we're talking about the 10 makas, and how there was also makas by the yam, and how each makkah consisted of 4 parts or 5 parts. So now we are going to continue and enumerate the great things that Hashem did for the Yidden. And so that's how we move into the Kama Mailas Tevis L'Mokim Aleinu, the whole Dayenu, and then finally the next section of Al Achas Kama V'Kama. And that goes all the way till L'chaper Kol V'Nisenu, and with that we conclude the Manashtana with Avadaminu, Mitchila, and the Arami Evid Avi. And then we move on to the next section, which is Pesach Matzah Umar. And like we said, it's brought in the Mishnah that Kol Shalei Omer Shleishet Dvarim Elu BaPesach LeYotze Yedei Chavasei Ve'eluin Pesach Matzah Umar. Now, while saying the words Matzah Umar by Pesach Matzah Umar, the Rebbe would look at the Matzah and Mar. And we proceed to explain each of these. Pesach, Shayavsinu Eichlim, Matzah Zu, and then Mar Zeh. Now, by Matzah Zu, we hold the 2nd and 3rd matzahs using the cover, the kaira, until the 2nd al shum. So we hold them while saying Matzah Zu Sha'anu Eichlim al shum al shum. And then by Mar Zeh, also there, so we place our right hand on the Mar and the left hand on the chazeres. So the Mar is the top one, the chazeres is the lower one. And again, it's until the 2nd al shum. Mar Zeh Sha'anu Eichlim al shum al shum. And with this, we finish the section of Pesach Matzah Umar, and we move on to the final section, which is how the Mishnah continues by saying B'chol Dar V'Dar. And since B'chol Dar V'Dar Chayiv Adam Lirsas Atzmei Kihilu Yatzmei Mitzrayim, so lefichach we need to praise Hashem and we say Hallel, and then we conclude with the bracha of Asher Golanu. So let's go through it. We have B'chol Dar V'Dar. So like we said, the Mishnah teaches that this is the next part of Maggid. Then it moves into the next 3 paragraphs, which are lefichach Anachnu Chayevim L'Hodos, and the first 2 prakim, the first 2 kapitulach of Hallel. So we say Hallel the way the Yidden said Hallel when they left Mitzrayim. Now these 2 first prakim of Hallel, they speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kriyas Yamsuf, and Matan Torah, which were in the past, and that's why we say them over here when we're speaking about Yetzias Mitzrayim. However, the later Prakim in Hallel, they talk about the Gula of the Asad Lavei, and so they come after the Suda since they're an Indian for themselves. So like we said, the Mishnah teaches that we continue on to the saying of part of Hallel. Now while saying Lefichach, we hold the kais for Lefichach, and so then we cover the matzahs until the end of Maggid. Now we only hold the cup for the actual paragraph of Lefichach, and the Agada says to hold it until the very end when we make the bracha of Beir Pri Hagafen. However, we only hold it for Lefichach, and we put it down for the 2 prokim of Hallel. But nevertheless, once we cover the matzahs and pick up the cup for Lefichach, we leave the matzahs covered until the end of Maggid, and then we move on to the bracha of Asher Ga'alanu. So we conclude Maggid with the bracha of Asher Ga'alanu, which is said instead of the bracha of Sha'asa Nisim Lavesheinu, and we pick up the case for the bracha of Asher Ga'alanu, and with that we conclude Maggid, and then we move on to the final part, which is when we make the bracha on the second cup of wine.
We